So welcome everyone. My name is Deborah Gonzalez. I am part of SOA Watch Collective. This weekend we are celebrating 30 years, the 30th anniversary of the movement to close School of the Americas. It was 30 years ago that Father Roy and other activists traveled to Fort Benning, Georgia to commemorate the first year since the massacre at the Universidad Centroamericana de El Salvador, Central America University of El Salvador, to demand the closing of this military school that had trained many of those responsible. Our movement was born from there, and for the past 30 years, together, we have uplifted the memory of the victims of US state-sponsored violence throughout the hemisphere. Through civil disobedience, organizing, researching, lobbying, and the grassroots efforts of many of you watching us today, we have worked at closing the School of Assassins and similar training sites. It's been through these 30 years of work that we have made the connections of the School of the Americas as a root cause of migration in its role of displacing communities, the violence that have forced a lot of people to flee. For many years, we've gathered at the gates of Fort Benning. And while this is the first year that we are not having an in-person mobilization, we are here together to continue to denounce and to continue to demand justice for all those that we've lost. Those that we have lost in detention centers this year, those that we have lost in the desert as well, those that are crossing, those that are disappeared. And so for several years, we had protests at Stewart Detention Center. Later on in 2016, we've had the border encuentros in Ambos Nogales. We have accompanied the family of Jose Antonio. And last year, in 2019, they joined us after their visit to the Supreme Court to support another mother, Guadalupe Huereca, in the search for her justice for her son, Sergio Adrian. So there's a long list of names and of people that that we continue to stand with in solidarity. And as our theme, it is Memoria y Resistencia, memory and resistance. And so here we are today in today's panel, Border Imperialism in 2020, DHS, Climate Change and Collective Resistance. I am excited to introduce with us Eduardo Correa, joining us from Mexico City. Eduardo Correa is a research professor at the Universidad Autonoma de la Ciudad de México, UNAM, in the Human Rights Graduate Program. He's a Latin-Americanist at the UNAM and a Chasqui, a Quechua word for the one who travels, collects, and carries a message. He is also a member of the Observatorio de Derechos Humanos de los Pueblos. Welcome, Eduardo. Bienvenido. Tienes la palabra.
I am very happy because I recognize the 30 years that SOA Watch has done. I know about the protests that you have had in front of Fort Benning at the School of the Americas ever since it was transferred from Panama to the United States. And I recognize the enormous research that you have been doing about militarism that comes from that base to the rest of the continent, training Latin American officials that create barbaric effects in our countries. I'm immensely grateful and very happy to be with you here. The first thing that I would like to comment on is the concept of imperialism, because we get used to talking about it, but many times we don't understand all of the complexities that the term has. And it's very important. The concept of imperialism, firstly, is the association, the partnership of financial capitalism with industrial capitalism, with commercial capitalism, which has a predominance, which is becomes part of the financial capital. It is a financial capital that has an expression in its gigantism with the International Monetary Fund, with the World Bank, and with the systems of stock markets that every time they become more linked to the illicit economy, with the economy that comes from narco trafficking, with trafficking with weapons, trafficking with women, with children, with organs, with animals that are close to extinction, with contraband, with the theft of automobiles, with prostitution. There is a lot that happens with this financial system, which has a lot to do with the illicit economy. That is the first component. The other two components are the despair to assure to have markets, to expand markets. The free trade agreements are a sign of that despair to expand and to secure more markets. The second big thing is the continuous attempt to have cheap labor. Is something that the World Bank has done to cheapen over the last 30 years in a very permanent manner all of the salaries of the Latin Americans. And there's no name for this. This is one of the factors that it's generating the migration, also a desperate migration from the people of Latin America. We see this in a very strong way from Central America, but there is a stream, a continuous stream of humanity that is coming from South America towards the United States, towards Mexico. It is a human stream, and it has to do with this process of cheapening the workforce. It is designed and developed by the World Bank with the argument that they are helping the poor people, but they're really making them poorer, making the people poorer. The other component, which is very important to mention, is the extraction of raw materials. This is what they're doing this in a very ghastly manner because they are taking the people and they're throwing them out of their communities, and they're doing this with the help of paramilitary armies. They're using these large amounts of money that narco trafficking produces in order to finance the paramilitary. And the paramilitary work in a very coordinated fashion with the armies of those countries in Latin America to remove the populations of farmers, of indigenous people from their territories, because modern mining, the extractivation today of petroleum, gas, silver, gold, nickel, copper, it does it in a way that poisons water. Fracking needs tons of water, which ends up poisoned in all of the streams, in the rivers, and in the subsoils. This water is what people would normally be drinking. But in order not to have mass killings because of the poisoning of the water, then they force them to leave by using terror. And finally, the fifth component, global component of imperialism, is the military apparatus with which this whole logistic operates, the logistics, financial logistics. And whenever there are economic trouble, um, like what we have been living for many years, but we can visualize it as a pathetic way since 2008. And when we were about to enter a new enormous crisis, but it has been covered today. The pandemic has covered it. It doesn't allow us to see the magnitude of this crisis. When you have a crisis, as Rosa Luxemburg says, with imperialism, you see the gunships coming back out to produce the colonization mechanisms. And also, you have an accumulation of capital, an accumulation of capital which was created through people's blood and fire. This is the period that we're living now in humanity. This that is called neoliberalism is the gunships that are again creating the mechanisms of colonialism, and they create these enormous programs because they have banks that are full of money and they don't know what to do with them. They create these programs like the Plan Puebla, Panama, and what they were thinking has never gone away. They changed the name, but what they had in mind is to create these mechanisms of production, of producing energy in enormous proportions to create, to remove all of these indigenous populations and the border between Guatemala and Mexico, to create this as a maquiladora zone, to remove all of their original production systems and community indigenous life. They want to create these dams and rivers, and they want to flood huge areas of jungle to create electrical energy, to transmit energy from Southern California to Panama and to cross the Darien Gap to create the ILSA project, which is a grand electrical connection which will end up in the Patagonia. It is a system of coordinating electricity from California to South America. This is what's coming as a package, so that AT&T, so that the ITT are able to sell their huge volume of cable, of copper wires, so that the Bechtel company, the engineering company in the United States, can build these dams and these distribution towers so that Westinghouse can sell their turbines for producing electricity. This is what imperialism means. This is association of financial capital with the industrial capital, with commercial capital, in order to make macro projects that will go over the people, which will stomp on people, and using this whole military-industrial complex of the United States, including mercenaries, the private armies, that they have themselves created, have helped to train in order to take out, to expulse the whole populations in order to take their territories. Today, the struggle is for those land, for that territory. Now the struggle is to defend Venezuela's petroleum, because part of that imperialism in their desperate search for raw materials, the petroleum resource is the most important of all. And there are possibilities now that there may be a war between Colombia and Venezuela. There is a great chance of that because the United States is using as an invasion platform Colombian territory to invade Venezuela. That is what border imperialism means.
Muchas gracias, Eduardo. Thank you so much, Eduardo, for your words. I feel that you really emphasize a few pieces on here, specifically one of the components of border imperialism, which is using the military, right, the militarization as in a violent way of displacing communities. And so we've seen this, right, as part of imperialism with SOA and the training that they've offered to militaries in Latin America, how all that has contributed to the violence, and then how they continue to use the same military against the people that are displaced and toward the people that are migrating, right? We know that the natural landscapes, not only are they being used to extract the resources, as you mentioned, Eduardo, but also we know that natural resources are used in a deadly way, such as the Arizona desert, the Sonoran desert in Arizona, border with Mexico. So this is a good segue. We're now going to present our next panelist, Paige Corich-Kleim, who is a volunteer with the humanitarian aid organization No More Deaths. No More Deaths has a mission to end death and suffering on the US-Mexico border. They leave food and water on migrant trails and provide first aid to people crossing the desert. So Paige, thank you so much for being here. You have 15 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm actually going to screen share. I have a couple slides that I'm going to present. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so thank you so much, Dev, for organizing and inviting me. Thank you, Eduardo, for the really amazing perspective and info on border imperialism. I'm going to kind of move us a bit further north to the border and talk about what we've been seeing this year. So I'm a volunteer with No More Deaths. We're a humanitarian aid organization. We work just in Arizona, and we again have our mission to end death and suffering along the border. And we do that through a lot of different projects, but the main ones that people know us for are for leaving food and water on migrant trails, as well as running first aid stations for people, so we can provide first aid and medical care to people and provide them with a place to rest. People also have often heard of our organization because over the last few years, we had criminal charges brought against various members. Some of those charges were for leaving water in some of the most deadly corridors. Some of those charges were for providing direct aid to people who are crossing. And we ended up eventually defeating all of those charges. So actually 1 year ago yesterday, one of our volunteers who was facing up to 20 years in prison was acquitted of all charges. So the past year, we've felt a little better about where our organization is at because we're not being criminalized for our work. But this year has also been one of the deadliest years in the desert. This year alone in Arizona, there have been 200 known migrant deaths, and that's only up until the end of October. So we still have 2 more months of reporting. And that is the most since 2010. This number, we also say it's known migrant deaths. It's missing people who have disappeared in the borderlands, so who were last seen and never seen again. And it's also missing some counties. So Yuma County, for example, doesn't report migrant deaths. So it's a huge number, but we also know it's a vast underrepresentation of what's actually happening. So I want to talk about why I think that that's happening, because it's, we were able to protect humanitarian aid, but the crisis that we're trying to intervene in seems like it's worse now. And so I think some of the reasons for that are a lot of it is related to the pandemic. The ports of entry have been closed to asylum seekers, and a lot of movement across the border has been limited using the pandemic as an excuse. And so people who in the past would present themselves at a port are now crossing through the desert. The US for a long time, as part of their border imperialism and border enforcement strategy, have used a strategy called prevention through deterrence, which intentionally funnels people into some of the most dangerous crossing zones. With an increase in border wall construction, it's funneling people even further away from towns and populated areas. So people are crossing in some of the most remote corridors. There's also been a lot of resistance to wall construction, specifically led by Atam and Kumaya people. So people should definitely look that up, because the wall's not just getting constructed with nobody trying to fight it. There's been a lot of resistance border wide. But it has funneled people further into remote areas. Also, due to COVID-19, people are being rapidly expelled using public health protocols. One called Title 42 allows the US government to, instead of putting somebody through deportation proceedings, they can just drive them to the nearest port of entry and drop them off in whatever town is closest. So they're no longer honoring any deportation agreements between the US and Mexico. They're just taking people to the nearest port and dumping them there. And a lot of these border communities have, there's a lot of cartel control, and there's not resources there to support people who might need medical care or might want to decide to not continue trying to cross. It's actually really difficult for people to leave those communities because of the kind of just the infrastructure that's there. With that as well, people from any country are being just driven to the US-Mexico border and dropped there. So people from Central America are just getting left. And then I think one of the other big factors is that this summer was the hottest summer on record. We also, just this month in November, we broke heat records in Phoenix. It was 99 degrees in November in Phoenix, which is a pretty extreme increase in temperature. So we think that the temperature increase, which is clearly due to climate change, has also really influenced this kind of changing pattern and worsening conditions along the border. With that, I think it really connects with a lot of the push factors that are happening due to climate change. We just had these massive hurricanes, and we haven't seen people starting to head north as a result of those, but I would expect to see that in the next few months, we're going to be talking to people whose homes and livelihoods were destroyed because of the two hurricanes that just passed through, which we know are also a result of changing climate. Driven by the fossil fuel industry and all of these things that we've mentioned before. And then kind of a way that a lot of these factors connect back to our work, we're also seeing over the past summer an increase in people who seek out humanitarian aid being targeted. So I mentioned that we run some first aid stations, or we call them humanitarian aid camps or stations. They're just remote desert areas where we have water and electricity, and we have kind of like a clinic style tent that we can treat people for some of the injuries that they have. Often that's dehydration or bad blisters, a lot of gastrointestinal things like diarrhea or vomiting, things that if you were in a city wouldn't be a big deal, but when you're in the desert, can really easily be deadly. And what we've seen, so we won in court. We were able to defend our volunteers that were facing criminal charges, but we, over the past year, have had multiple raids at our aid station where the people that had sought out aid were targeted. And so these are photos from a raid that happened in July. It was a very military, very heavily armed raid. They're essentially coming with a Bearcat tank and full military fatigues to raid a clinic. They used, so this is Border Patrol, but it's specifically BORTAC, which is kind of the SWAT team arm of Border Patrol. It's like the heavily armed police wing that has been also deployed in the interior of the country, especially in relation to all of the uprisings in defense of Black lives. We saw BORTAC be deployed in Portland. In the past, they've been deployed in LA and other places. And they've also been deployed abroad in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now we're seeing that they're targeting people who are seeking humanitarian aid by using our almost using our aid stations as part of their enforcement strategy. So for this specific raid, it was in July, and there were about 40 people who had come to the camp and were seeking care. And we know at least 10 of those people Border Patrol tracked in the desert for multiple days, basically waiting for them to get to the aid station where they could then raid it. So they entered with a tank with guns drawn to come into a clinic. On this photo on the right, you can also see that they brought a cameraman. So they really just came in with a lot of force and proceeded to chase and scatter people and arrest them, and then also destroy supplies and infrastructure. And I think what's notable is that they detained the aid worker volunteers, but they did not arrest any of them. And I think that's a result of us winning in court. But I think it really speaks to the way in which just protecting aid workers or humanitarian aid is not enough to end death and suffering. Our work is not the solution to this crisis. We need to address these root causes that are the policies, the push factors in Latin America. It's much bigger than just our work. So then again, in October, we had a second raid. This time 12 people were arrested who had sought out care. Again, volunteers were detained. During both raids, people also had all of their cell phones taken and were detained away from where all of the people had been receiving care. So they very much did not want a witness to what was happening. They were trying to kind of cover what they were doing. But again, no volunteers were arrested, and I think it was pretty stark to see the amount of media attention that we got, especially compared to how much outcry there was about previous arrests of volunteers like Scott Warren. The arrest of one man versus 50 people. I think it just really illustrated how normal it has become for folks to be targeted in the borderlands, and that violence has not changed in the past year. So I think what we saw with these raids were actually really normal everyday events. We just were there and they were targeting people in our space. But these actions are things that happen in the desert all the time. I'm doing out of time. Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of where we've been for the past year. It's been a pretty harsh year. We are still in the field though, doing our work and responding in the ways that we can. We've had to alter our programming and how we function based on COVID and different protocols. But in January, we're going to release an abuse documentation report about emergency non-response in the borderlands that I think Deb is also going to help us with. So we are continuing our work and doing what we can. And I think with Biden being elected, I think we're also going to kind of see how that affects things. I think it's likely that wall construction may stop. But the last time that Biden was in office, their administration deported 3 million people. And so we, we're not expecting things to change overnight. We think our work will still be needed. And we also, just think and want to remind everybody that all of the gains like DACA and different things that happened under Obama were won by people organizing. And so we want to keep up the momentum. I know people were a lot of people were radicalized and started organizing and being involved under Trump. And that same drive and energy, we need to keep going, because it's not going to change overnight, and all of these factors are going to be ongoing, and they're way beyond Trump. These are things that have been happening for decades at this point. If you want to follow us for updates, we're on social media, and we also have a website, so feel free to check us out and follow our work. But that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paige, for that connection. I think that talking about BORTAC is a really, really important thing to do when we talk about border imperialism in 2020, right? And I think that the other part that you mentioned is that border imperialism isn't something that has started under the Trump administration. This is something that we repeat, and we always say that it is a bipartisan effort to have the conditions in detention centers, have the conditions in for people crossing. The expansion of border imperialism is a bipartisan effort. It is not just something that we have seen in the last 4 years, unfortunately. And so it is very important to speak of BORTAC, the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, in their targeting around against, of course, no more deaths, and what they were doing, right? The amount of people that they've arrested, showing up with their cameras, right? Like, they like to portray themselves, Border Patrol likes to portray themselves as a humanitarian organization. But when you go and you are, when they go and raid the camps, as they did 2 times during the hottest year on record, it is also, you can't be the perpetrators of violence and also the ones that are providing humanitarian aid. And it's very, very clear when they show up and they raid camp. And BORTAC has also been involved in the Black Lives Matter protests. And in their response in Portland, Oregon, they were the ones that were detaining people and putting them in unmarked vehicles. And so when we talk about the impacts of COVID, when we talk about the impacts of heat, we also remember like the community resistance and the organizing that there is in support of the people that are crossing. Additionally, I think that you're right? The work that you all are doing is not something that exists in a vacuum. It's something that we all must do. And so with this, I am going to introduce our next panelist, Azadeh Shashahani, Legal and Advocacy Director of Project South in Atlanta, Georgia. Azadeh has worked for a number of years in the US South to protect and defend immigrants and Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. She previously served as president of the National Lawyers Guild and as National Security Immigrants' Rights Project Director with ACLU of Georgia. She is the author or editor of several human rights reports, including a 2017 report titled Imprisoned Justice Inside 2 Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers, which focuses on Stewart Detention Center and Irwin County Detention Center. And so I keep mentioning Stewart Detention Center throughout this presentation. It's because it is a very, very deadly detention center. And Azadeh will speak more, but for many years in the history of SOA Watch, we have been at Stewart Detention, and we've demanded for the shutting of this detention center along with all the others. So Azadeh, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Azadeh Shahshahani. I work with Project South. We are a social justice organization based in Atlanta, and we work in support of grassroots organizations and directly impacted communities in the US South as well as the Global South. We are part of a movement that believes systemic state violence is not to be tolerated in any form, whether it is ICE caging and harming immigrants or cop murdering Black people in the street with impunity. I wanted to thank School of America's Watch for all the really amazing work you all have been doing in terms of exposing US imperialism and trying to dismantle US imperialism and the connections with forced migration. And I should say your support also for shutting down the Stewart Detention Center based in Georgia has been really important. In 2015, the rally that was jointly co-sponsored by School of America's Watch aimed at shutting down the Stewart Detention Center drew about 1,000 people from all over the US and the world, and probably was the largest action ever directed at an immigration detention center. So I wanted to talk about the Irving County Detention Center that has been in the news a lot because of the forced gynecological procedures, as well as say a couple words about the Stewart Detention Center. So we've documented conditions at Irving for many years, and we know that the treatment of immigrants at this prison has always been horrid. In our 2017 report, In Prison Justice Inside Two Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers, Project South and the Penn State Law Center for Immigrants' Rights Clinic found evidence of sexual abuse, inadequate medical care, lack of prenatal care for pregnant women, a lack of clean drinking water, and rampant use of solitary confinement at the facility. In April, a group of women got together and produced a video about the conditions at the facility and their fear of catching COVID. Instead of addressing their concerns, the facility run by a private prison corporation, LaSalle, retaliated against them by placing them in solitary confinement, which, as you can imagine, subjected them to grave emotional harm. We filed a complaint along with our partners on the ground, the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, GLAR, Georgia Detention Watch, and the South Georgia Support Network. We filed a complaint on September 14th with the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General. And we're also honored to represent Ms. Dawn Wooten, who's a courageous whistleblowing nurse who used to work at Irving along with the Government Accountability Project. And just some of the issues that we documented in the complaint were that medical staff were deliberately not testing detained immigrants for COVID-19, even when they were symptomatic or had pre-existing conditions or had requested to be tested multiple times spanning a month. And I should say that the facility refused to test people up until Project South filed a separate complaint, and only at that point did they start testing people. Also, another issue we documented is that medical staff was shredding medical requests from detained immigrants and fabricating medical records for them, falsely indicating that they have been seen, and the management mandating employees to work even if they're symptomatic and waiting for test results. So the shocking revelations about medical abuse against women's bodies further highlight the extent of the egregious abuse at the facility and the fact that Black and brown immigrant women have been held in an extremely vulnerable position at this prison where they have no control over their bodies and no say over what is done to them is sickening. We are glad that our complaint opened the door to more women coming forward with accounts of what was done to them. There were 19 cases documented by the Los Angeles Times and 57 cases documented by our collective team of lawyers as reported by The Intercept. Not surprisingly, ICE has not been forthcoming with the information. If it wasn't because of the documentation work happening and advocates' efforts to track down and reach out to women all over the world and the courage of the impacted women, none of this would have ever come to light. Not only is ICE not cooperating in the investigation, They're actively trying to erase the evidence and cover their own tracks. So as we speak, they're trying to deport witnesses to and survivors of medical abuse at Irving. Given what we have learned about the systematic violence against immigrants' bodies at Irving, we need ICE to come clean about what is happening at facilities nationwide, because immigrants cannot have their bodily integrity at the mercy of ICE and the private prison corporations that the agency contracts with. That's why we filed the Freedom of Information Act request to obtain information about gynecological procedures at ICE facilities nationwide a couple months ago. We did not receive any information. And that is why we partnered with a couple other organizations, CREW and the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild, to file a lawsuit against ICE to force them to turn over documents to us. And it pains me to know that there could be many more women out there who will never be able to talk about what happened to them and the abuse that they suffered while at Irving, let alone receive a measure of redress, while living with the lifelong damage to their bodies and spirits. The scrutiny must not stop with examining the actions of one individual. This is about the system, about ICE and the private prison corporations that ICE contracts with. Irving should be shut down immediately and people should be freed. And the US government, as well as a private prison corporation running this prison, should be held accountable. So we're glad that some members of Congress are starting to take action. There was a letter that was signed on by multiple members of Congress from both houses demanding that ICE stop deporting witnesses to and survivors of medical abuse. In addition, 12 members of Congress came down a couple months ago and met with the detained women. And after they got out, they called it a horror show, and they have called for the facility to be shut down. In addition, the squad led by Representative Rashida Tlaib has sent a communication to the UN High Commissioner requesting that they investigate the Department of Homeland Security, which to my knowledge is the first time that members of US Congress are calling on the United Nations to investigate a branch of the US government. But we need them to do more, right? We are determined to push ahead by pursuing a thorough congressional investigation, DHS OIG investigation, and we have also gone to the UN and the Inter-American Commission to expose the human rights violations. The conditions at Irving are also, at the Stewart Detention Center, are also horrible. There's a forced labor program at Stewart where immigrants are paid between $1 to $4 a day, or sometimes nothing at all, for doing the work that the facility would have had to hire regularly waged employees to do. And this also is a privately run prison run by Core Civic, used to be called CCA, that has a horrible track record. And so we're currently involved in a class action lawsuit against Core Civic to try to put an end to this forced labor program. And when immigrants refused to participate in this forced labor program, they were subjected to solitary confinement or were deprived of life necessities. So one of our clients, Shoaib Ahmed, who had been working for several days without getting paid, he said, no work tomorrow. And for that, he was placed in solitary confinement. He has since been deported, but continues to live with the damage that being detained at Stewart and the solitary confinement did to his body and spirit. There have been 3 deaths at the facility just during the pandemic. There have been 7 deaths since May of 2017, including 2 suicides. With 2 individuals who were experiencing emotional and mental health issues. Instead of the facility responding to those needs, placed them in solitary confinement, and as a result, they hung themselves. The deaths during the pandemic, Cipriano Chavez Alvarez, Santiago Button Oxlage, and Jose Freddy Guillen Vega. 2 of them were elderly and 1 of them had diabetes, which poses the question as to why ICE would continue to hold the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions in a deadly facility in the midst of the pandemic. So we will push forward in partnership with organizations such as School of America's Watch to shut this place down. And it should have been shut down a long time ago. In closing, I would like to leave you with this quote from Fannie Lou Hamer: "Nobody's free until everybody's free." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Azadeh, for this super powerful presentation. I mean, it is an act of genocide to these like hysterectomies on these women is definitely, it's an act of genocide, right? And it is an effort to kill our communities in any way, right? Like if you don't survive in, like if you have to flee in Latin America and you have to cross the border, it's like there is an attempt to kill our people in every single direction. So with this, we are having a space of questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. Right now we have a question for Eduardo. Eduardo, what are the factors that lead to the violence on the border between Mexico and Estados Unidos?
I think I
think that, first of all, the huge amount of displacement, forced displacement, that starts in their own territories. This is something that's very violent. In Colombia, for example, there is a huge forced displacement, close to 8 million campesinos, farm workers, but that same thing is happening in Central America. This whole idea of throwing out the farm workers happens in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador. And these inhabitants that had been displaced from their lands, rural lands, and now they move to the cities, and now they are being displaced from the cities. And that is generating that there is really huge masses of displaced people. The second great violence that is being lived is crossing Mexico. Mexico has become a living wall opposed to the movement of humans that is going towards the United States. We have to think that the groups which are transported by air of the Mexican army, the rapid action command of the Mexican government, the GAFES, they ended up becoming the Zetas. And the Zetas, during a period, by using all of their narco-traffic resources that were made available to them, because they were the most important cartel in the Gulf, they began to mobilize as part of control of the whole illicit economy in the area of the Gulf. In the Gulf, also, they started acting like, what do you call the people who move people around? They started using them as people who were able to bring people migrants into the United States. And it seems like the great suspicion is that from the Pentagon, they got an order to start shooting killing all of the migrants. Now we know that they are responsible for more than 30,000 disappearances, which were attempting to cross Mexico. So to that you add what happens at the border of the United States, where this human mass of people that's trying to enter the United States continues to grow. Now you have older people, you have people from Haiti, from the Caribbean, you have Argentinians, you have people from Brazil, you have this human mass of people that are trying to enter, and they have been growing. And so therefore the pressure that is being put upon at the border, this contradiction that is happening at the border, causes these actions from Trump's border wall to all of these other places that we see where people are suffering not just by the temperature, but also by the military and the mercenaries who are acting as a border patrol. And they're causing that violence be a continuous thing against this ocean of people that have been thrown out of their own territories. I share with you that these hurricanes, these cyclones that just crossed over Central America will produce as a secondary effect a much greater, much more massive population of Central American people. And where will they go? They're going to try to go and be part of the American way of life, this lying fantasy that has been sold to them that they can create a better way of life, which is not true. Thank you.
Sí, gracias, Eduardo. Thank you, Eduardo. And so there is a question here for Azadeh. A message from Daniela Gonzalez that your presentation was very powerful. And it takes us to say that we don't want to return to the so-called normal ways of being, but we want to destroy that old way in spaces where we can be free and we can live in peace as people of the world. There is also another question for you. Curious if you identify any connections of climate change in your work.
Thank you very much. We don't directly work on issues of climate change, but we do because Project South works with a collective of grassroots organizations in the U.S. South. So we work with organizations in New Orleans, for example, that after Katrina in particular, where the devastation of the related to climate injustice was brought to the fore. They've been doing a lot on that issue, and so we work jointly in coalition with them, and I'll put their website in the chat in a second. And in response to Daniela, thank you very much, and I fully agree. We're not about to, our mission is not to reform the system. We don't want to make these prisons prettier. We want to shut them down. And I think the abolition framework is a really powerful one for us to look to. Not only domestically, obviously, domestically, we need to be getting rid of these prisons and, the policing and the repression system, but also, globally. Right. So, over the summer, we heard cries related to, abolition of the police and why are the U.S. police being militarized, and, very much true, right? We don't want to see tactics of repression and militarization deployed against people in this country. But then at the same time, we don't want those same tactics being employed against people in the global South. So, we very much need to be making the connections in terms of dismantling white supremacy, the prison industrial complex, and US imperialism, and they're all very much connected to each other. And so again, I want to thank School of America's Watch for your work in that regard and bringing the issues to the fore.
Thank you. And another question for you is there any action that the attendees and people here can take in support of the women whose autonomy has been stolen from them?
Sure, there is a fundraiser, and I'll try to look at the link and put it in the chat. For people in the US, though, what is really important is to keep the pressure up on your member of Congress, because the only reason that they were moved to action was because of the public outrage this time around. Yeah, I can't tell you how many letters Project South and partners had sent to Congress in the past few years, after our 2017 report came out, multiple other letters. In the spring, we sent a letter to Congress asking them to put pressure on ICE to free people in light of COVID. And we received nothing, zero in response. This time around, again, because of the public outrage, they were finally moved to action. And so, we really need to keep the pressure up. So please do continue to contact your member of Congress and ask them to push forward to shutting Ervin down and to provide support and redress for the survivors of medical abuse.
Thank you. And the next question is for Paige. Paige, I want to talk a little bit more about BORTAC, the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, right? In 2015, we learned that at WINSEC, it was the first Border Patrol graduate. In reading the article and learning the information, we know that he actually is part of BORTAC, right? So it leads us to have questions of what really is their role? Is there any limit to the mandate that they have? It seems like they respond to any kind of so-called crisis that arises, right? I mean, the raids at camp, but also you mentioned being deployed to LA. Do you have a little bit of background and more information on BORTAC or those instances?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, again, Border Patrol, BORTAC is it's like Border Patrol Tactical Unit. So they have enhanced training, enhanced weapons. They've been deployed abroad. But I think one of the things that is most concerning about them is that they're part of the Department of Homeland Security. So anything that kind of falls into national security, which, as we know, the US believes it should enforce its national security beyond its borders, kind of falls into things that BORTAC is able to respond to. And a lot of people have kind of been calling them Trump's secret police. The Border Patrol Union endorsed Trump. They're very, as a law enforcement agency, they're very pro-Trump because he's kind of given them a lot more tools and looked the other way for a lot of their really violent tactics. They've been violent for a really long time, but under his administration, they've been allowed to be a lot more explicit and open about that violence. And there's very little oversight because anything, again, can just be called national security. So it's also a secret and they don't need to have any accountability or transparency. So I think it's really frightening, because I don't know what their limits are. If anything can be part of national security, that usually means defending US economic interests in the form of imperialism. So it really opens the door for a lot of violence that is directed against undocumented communities and people of color. And so I think keeping an eye on what they're doing and trying to hold them accountable, I think is really difficult, but also extremely necessary. And a lot of people have been calling, especially with that abolition mindset as well, we don't want them to have nicer tactics. We want to defund these agencies and figure out a better system because they've kind of fallen with, abolish ICE, abolish police, defund I think BORTAC and Border Patrol fall into that and need to be part of those calls as well, and have been.
Thank you. And so I'm hearing a lot of the need for abolition, right? Abolition of these systems, of these structures that criminalize, dehumanize, use the use the natural landscape as weapons that impact the natural resources, right? As Eduardo was speaking earlier about why and the role of imperialism, what the impact of it is the destruction of water, right? Water is life. And so there is a connection when we're talking about border imperialism, when we're talking about imperialism as a whole, right? And the connection with indigenous communities like Berta Cáceres, for example, who was assassinated in 2016 for her struggle in defending the natural river, like the river and her ancestral land. And so that, in connection to the corporations that played a role in her assassination, right, for economic interest, but also the fact that 2 of those intellectual authors of 8 were also trained at School of the Americas, right? When this BORTAC agent trained at WINSEC, at School of the Americas, right? And maybe Azadeh, if you can talk to us a little bit more as well about the current role of ICE at Fort Benning.
I mean, definitely. I think, a lot needs to be, a lot more needs to be discovered about, what exactly they're doing. But there was information brought to light that ICE is actually receiving training about, conducting raids. And given all that we know about how violent and aggressive ICE has been as an agency, in terms of going after people, it is truly concerning that there is now this partnership being formed between ICE, this overt partnership between ICE and the US military, for basically perfecting their tactics of repression. And of course, as has been the case for many decades, those same tactics are also being exported to countries in the global south. So we just need to put a stop to the entire system of exchange. And related to that, I do want to mention too, in terms of police exchange, an issue that folks need to pay attention to is also police exchanges between various agencies in the US and Israel, which we know is also an expert in tactics of repression. So for example, in Atlanta, US police in Atlanta have been sent to Israel for a number of years to learn tactics of repression, and then come back and implement those same tactics against communities of color in the US. And so the city of Durham, North Carolina actually had a success in terms of ending that partnership. And in Atlanta and other parts of the country, folks are trying to emulate that success. So I'm going to share an article in the chat to share more information about that. But I think, as we're talking about dismantling, militarization and police violence, we also need to be talking about ending these types of police exchanges.
Yes, absolutely. And going back to one of the points that you made, right, is the relationship between ICE and WINSEC, about how we don't, because of the few years, right? All the years that SOA Watch has kept an eye on the SOA, that we received the names, we don't receive those names anymore of the graduates. What we do receive is the number of people per country that are trained at WINSEC. And we know that in 2019, it was over 90 people from the United States that were trained there. What positions did they hold? Were they part of ICE? Were they part of BORTAC? What Like, we need to know exactly what is happening so we can also hold to them accountable, right? There is this very overt intersection that's happening between the military and ICE and Border Patrol in attacking, and the results of that is attacking our communities. Eduardo, I want to go to you to ask you and see if you can talk about the Safe Third Country Agreement.
What I forgot to say in my previous answer, when I was talking about the connection between the GAFES and the CETAs, the same structure that ends up becoming a paramilitary group. Well, I can't forget to mention that these were people that were trained at Fort Benning, and they were retrained at Fort Bragg at the Rapid Action Command of the U.S. Army with the Green Berets. And after that, they became a group of narco traffickers. And this doesn't make sense at all. This is crazy logic. And perhaps we should finish by mentioning them as the people who, at the end of a long story, which I don't want to go into now, but they ended up getting the gas reserves of Mexico and turning it over to Halliburton, which is pumping out the gas by using fracking at the Cuenca de Burgos, the Burgos Basin between Tamaulipas and Coahuila. It's very important for you to know this. This is amazing. The connection that happens between the Pentagon with these paramilitary groups that supposedly are narco traffickers, but who end up killing a massive amount of immigrants. This is something that we have to understand well, because it is the large human drama. And if you would please ask me that question that you had for me, I was wandered off a bit. Yes, we wanted to talk about the third safe country. Look, what that is all about is to make sure that the smallest amount of people from Central and South America get to the United States. Their logic of this is that they want Mexico or Guatemala or both be the countries that receives this massive amount of migrants who are requesting asylum. This is a request for human protection of their lives, because they have suffered an enormous violence, political, social, in their countries. These are people that have been threatened with death. They massive threats of death have befallen them, and they come after living some horrific experiences. So they are asking the United States Embassy and of Canada to open or to let them be in a refuge, some asylum there in the United States, while the embassy does the research to find out what is the reality with these people. But then they ask Mexico and Guatemala to be a third safe country, to be allowed to stay there while they're investigating whether it's really very important that these people be allowed into the U.S. The effect that this has is that they end up being jailed in Mexico or Guatemala. They don't have a space where they could cross into the U.S., and while they're waiting, they end up in security houses, which are really jails, which are really concentration camps where they're being placed.
Y es irónico de que se diga que ese es un lugar seguro para estar si de allí están huyendo las personas. And so it's ironic that that is a place where they can safely arrive, where migrants can safely arrive and wait when people are fleeing from those countries for a reason, right? For the violence that is ravaging communities, but US trained, US funded violence. So we are gonna start here and we're gonna stop here. I want to say thank you so much for all of the panelists. Muchas gracias, Eduardo. Thank you so much, Azadeh. Thank you so much, Paige, for giving us this really powerful panel, right? We've talked about all the intersections of the military, of corporations, of money, of root causes of migration, how that also comes into play along the border where people are crossing, the role of climate change, of the heat that is ravaging, that is deadly, right? The amount of people that are disappeared. And so if it was the deadliest year of people's whose bodies were found, how many people's bodies were not? And so that is a mother, that is a father, that is a child that is gone, and that whose family is also seeking and looking for them, right? And so I'm going to end here. I want to remind you all that we have one more panel after this one, and tomorrow we have one more panel after this one, and tomorrow also we want to invite you to join us at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time for Litany and Presentes. We are going to hold those that have perished this last year in our hearts, in our memory, and while we cannot be in one space, while we cannot be in one space together, our energies and our thoughts and we stand in solidarity with them. And just because we have to take these precautions this year doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to fight until all these systems of oppression are abolished, not reformed, but abolished. So thank you all so much for being here. And we look forward to seeing you later on this weekend and for the next webinar. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Gracias a todos.